Greetings folks, welcome back to what is very obviously not my little corner of the library. Today on a very special episode of Hometown History, we are here in New York's Central Park, going off on an adventure, getting out of the library like any good historian sooner or later has to do. Now in the last episode we talked a little bit about the early methods by which New Yorkers were able to obtain their water supply. And today we're going off to see if we can find any physical remains of some of those methods. Just because the Yorkville Reservoir was decommissioned in 1930 and Murray Hill went the way of the dodo in 1898 doesn't mean that no physical remains of those two structures exists today. And that's what we're going to go try and find. But enough jawing, you don't want to see me here talking all day long. Let's see what we can go find. I'm standing here just north of the Delacorte Theater, where Shakespeare in the Park is put on. But what most people waiting in line for theater tickets don't realize is that just on the other side of that sidewalk lies this innocuous-looking set of stones. Now this formed part of the outer wall of the western edge of the Yorkville Reservoir, and they're lined up about northeast to southwest, in parallel to the city grid. Now this wasn't an accident, this was done intentionally. The Yorkville Reservoir went from 79th Street in the south to 86th Street in the north. On the east side, started at 6th Avenue and went to 7th Avenue on the west. Now, if I were standing on top of these stones and looking south, if I could see through the trees and the theater, of course, I'd see that I'm lined up almost perfectly with 7th Avenue. Now, even though the city was mostly consolidated below 14th Street at the time this reservoir was built, it was lined up with the 1812 survey because it was trying to accommodate for the idea that the city would eventually expand north along the island of Manhattan. The water behind me is called Turtle Pond, and today is the only water remaining in this area of Central Park. Although if this were 1842, all of this, the entire Great Lawn, would be under about 200 million gallons of water at the bottom of the Yorkville Reservoir. Now the bedrock that you see behind me was called Vista Point and was actually designed into the walls of the reservoir. It was a two-wall system. The first, which formed the rectangular outline of the city grid, went into the bedrock, forming the south wall, and then out again on the western side. The second wall, which was the inner wall, contoured to the outline of the bedrock. Now in 1860, with construction of Central Park in full swing, Calvert Vall, who was one of the park's co-designers, petitioned the Aqueduct Committee for permission to remove the outer wall that went over the top of Vista Rock. In its place, he built what you also see behind me, his architectural folly, Belvedere Castle. Now today it forms a popular destination for tourists, although it also functions as a United States Weather Service U.S. meteorological site. Today, anytime you hear the weather in Central Park, that's where the information's coming from. We're up here on the observation platform of Belvedere Castle, and behind me you can see the Great Lawn. Now, in 1842, we would have been looking out over a nice scenic vista entirely of water from Yorkville. The reservoir was decommissioned in 1930, and there were a lot of ideas as to what to do with the property, from a parade ground to a war memorial. Ultimately, the idea of having baseball diamonds and a public recreational space won out. From 1931 to 1934, the reservoir was filled in, mostly with matter excavated from the 8th Avenue subway line, as well as from the newly constructed Rockefeller Center. In 1937, the Great Lawn would officially open. Now we saw the little piece of wall that was protruding up from the ground just above the Delacorte Theater, and we looked at the bedrock that was below the Belvedere Castle, but neither of those two pieces really give us any indication of how the Yorkville Reservoir looked when it existed. But fortunately, one piece escaped the wrecking ball. Most of the stones of the Yorkville Reservoir were torn down or simply covered over. A lot of them went to building the walls of the 86th Street Traverse that's behind me here. But one piece remained intact. If you follow me over here, buried just in a little bit of brush, this right here was the northeast corner of the original Yorkville Reservoir and is the only piece remaining intact. We're sitting here in front of the main building of the New York Public Library at 42nd Street and 5th Avenue. Now, the library building was built from 1898 until 1911 and sits on the same site as the old Murray Hill distributing reservoir. But just because the library is here now doesn't mean there's no trace of the distributing reservoir that still remains. Let's head on inside and see if we can't find a piece of the old building that's still visible. We're standing here in the south court of the New York Public Library's central building, and from this vantage point, if you look down over the side, you can actually see one of the original remains of the old Murray Hill Reservoir. Now, the building was constructed of white Vermont marble, but as it goes down, you can see it's supported on a bed of sort of brownish, reddish granite. That is some of the original foundation material of the Murray Hill Reservoir, and when the reservoir was torn down and the library was built, they reused some of that foundation. It's not necessarily in the same place it was when the reservoir sat on top of it, but it's the reusing of the materials and the fact that it still exists that's important. One of the things I love about the history of an area as rich and varied as New York City is that nothing is ever really gone. The Murray Hill Reservoir, case in point. Now we're here at the corner of Columbus and 60th Street, and behind me is the Church of St. Paul the Apostle. Now the main church building was built from 1875 until 1885, and a lot of the stone used to build the building was salvaged from other structures in the city. Some of it was gotten from Booth's Theater, some of it was had from the old Croton Aqueduct on the Upper West Side. By the time the building was consecrated in 1885, only 95 of the proposed 115 feet had actually been built. The remaining 20 feet, mostly the bell towers you see above me, were only built in 1898. Now, if that year sounds familiar, it should. It's the same year that the Murray Hill Reservoir was decommissioned. A lot of the stone used to build the bell towers was gotten at a discounted price by the church, and the remaining 20 feet of the building, up to 115 feet, could finally be constructed. Well, that's all we've got for you today, folks. Thanks for following along with me on this little outdoor field trip. I know it's kind of different from my normal style of programming, but I hope you enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun doing it. In putting in a lot of the research for this episode, I came across a bunch of other little odd and unusual stories that aren't necessarily related to the reservoir system. I took a lot of them and put them over in the latest blog entry at the Bookworm History blog. I'll leave a direct link to that in the description down below. Be sure to check out our most recent episode as well for some more information on the reservoir system and a lot of New York's other early water projects. Hit that subscribe button on your way out the door so you stay up to date on all of our latest episodes. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for stopping by.